I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
The television industry has always been brutal in its visibility. Millions of people tune in to see the same face, hear the same voice, trust the same authority night after night, year after year. And then, without warning, that face is gone. What happens to these public figures when their careers implode? Where do they go? How do they rebuild? Or do they simply disappear? The stories of fallen news anchors reveal something uncomfortable about the distance between public identity and private survival. For nearly 2 decades, one particular journalist built an impressive legacy reporting from dangerous places. She covered humanitarian crises, military conflicts, and natural disasters with a steady presence that viewers depended on. Her reputation was built on genuine curiosity and compassion, not theatrical performance. She was elevated to one of the most prestigious positions in morning television, sitting alongside one of the industry's most powerful personalities. But within a single year, everything changed. The decision to remove her came down to internal politics and personal preferences rather than any professional failure on her part. She was collateral damage in someone else's power play. What followed her departure was a slow fade. She remained with the network for several more years in a reduced capacity, assigned work that never quite matched what she had been doing before. When she finally left, she pursued documentary work and hosted some meaningful programs on smaller platforms. Yet the daily visibility that had defined her career never returned. As of 2026, she continues to work independently and maintain some public presence. But the pinnacle of her career remains in the past. Her story is distinctive because it demonstrates how sometimes the greatest falls have nothing to do with personal failure. They're simply consequences of losing a power struggle. The most watched evening news anchor in America had an entirely different kind of collapse. He inherited one of broadcasting's most prestigious positions and transformed it into a dominant force. His combination of authority, wit, and apparent credibility made him one of the most recognized figures in journalism. For over a decade, his newscast consistently topped the ratings. Then, in 2015, everything became public in a devastating way. A story he had repeatedly told about his experience in a war zone turned out to be inaccurate in fundamental ways. His version of events didn't match what those who were actually present remembered. The military personnel involved pushed back publicly, and the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. The investigation that followed revealed more than just this single incident. Questions emerged about other stories he had told on air, other moments where his recollection of events appeared to differ from what actually happened. For a journalist, credibility isn't just important, it's everything. It's the entire foundation of the profession. Without it, there's nothing left to stand on. He was moved to a different division of the network, hosted a late-night program that never found its audience, and eventually his contract ran out. But unlike some anchors who completely disappeared, he didn't vanish entirely. He pursued volunteer firefighting, took assignments from streaming platforms, and eventually secured a podcast deal with a major company. His recovery wasn't complete, but it suggested that redemption, even partial redemption, was possible. Then there was the morning television host who operated for 2 decades as a fixture so familiar that his presence felt like furniture in American homes. Every weekday morning for 20 years, he was there, reliable and consistent. In November 2017, NBC fired him within 24 hours of receiving a formal complaint about inappropriate conduct. The firing was swift and public, announced through a statement released early in the morning. His co-anchors had to acknowledge the news live on the air, in front of millions of people, on the same show he had hosted for 2 decades. The awkwardness was palpable to everyone watching. More allegations followed. The patterns described by multiple women painted a picture that went beyond what could be easily dismissed. For years after his firing, he was essentially invisible. He didn't appear in public, wasn't photographed, seemingly removed himself entirely from the world he had inhabited for so long. Reports suggested he spent years living quietly in the Hamptons, disconnected from former colleagues and friends. Unlike other fallen anchors, he made no visible attempt to rebuild professionally. No podcast, no new ventures, no media projects designed to reclaim some form of relevance. By 2023, reports indicated his personal life had stabilized. He had rebuilt relationships with his family, was in a long-term relationship, and spent time at properties in multiple locations. But professionally, the platform he held for 20 years remained completely gone. His represents one of the most complete professional disappearances, and it's one that most observers accepted without much. A veteran journalist who built one of the most respected interview programs in American television had spent more than 2 decades conducting in-depth conversations with the most significant figures in politics, business, arts, and culture. His late-night show on public broadcasting became synonymous with serious journalism and substantive discourse. He also anchored a morning news program, giving him presence across both elite public television and mainstream broadcast audiences. By 2017, he was one of the most prominent journalists in America, a figure respected across the industry for decades of serious work. In November 2017, The Washington Post published an investigation detailing allegations from multiple women describing inappropriate behavior. Within days, all 3 networks he worked with terminated their relationships with him. Additional women came forward, and the total number of allegations eventually exceeded 30. He issued a statement claiming some accounts were inaccurate while acknowledging others, but the damage was irreversible. His programs were pulled, his contracts were terminated, and the reputation he had constructed across decades was dismantled in weeks. What followed was geographic and social isolation. He retreated to his home on Long Island, avoiding neighbors and withdrawing from the professional and social networks he had maintained for decades. He made occasional attempts to maintain some form of presence through a personal website where he posted interview content, but the reach was minimal compared to what he had commanded with major broadcast partners. Television networks never brought him back, and his digital projects generated negligible attention. His case represents one of the most complete professional endings because the conduct he was accused of was extensively documented and involved people across multiple organizations over an extended period. A younger anchor who spent nearly a decade building visibility and credibility at an entertainment news network had a different kind of ending. He was warm, knowledgeable, and genuinely enthusiastic about his subject matter, qualities that are genuinely difficult to pull off authentically in entertainment journalism. He was good at what he did, and the audience responded to him. But his firing in 2002 came from an unexpected direction. During contract renegotiations, he posted something on his personal website, encouraging fans to write to the network supporting him. When the network asked if he had used a company computer to make that post, he said no. He had used a company computer. When they confirmed this, they used the lie as grounds for immediate termination. What happened next was worse than the firing itself. He tried to find work in television and was consistently told he was too closely associated with his former employer to be hired anywhere else. The identity he had built over nearly a decade had become a barrier to employment. He eventually left Los Angeles and moved to Chicago to care for aging parents, taking a job at a retail store selling electronics. The gap between that reality and where he had been was significant enough that he described turning to alcohol to manage the psychological difficulty of the transition. He spent years drinking heavily before achieving sobriety around 2016. Those Chicago years were profoundly important. He was essentially starting over from nothing in a city where nobody knew him as a television personality. He worked a retail job alongside people who had no idea he had spent years interviewing major celebrities. That kind of anonymity, after being a recognizable face in a visible industry, carries particular weight. He has described that period as one of genuine reckoning, a time when the distance between who he had been professionally and who he was daily forced him to confront which version of himself was actually real. Since getting sober, he has worked to rebuild through a podcast where he interviews people connected to the entertainment industry. He has been candid about his sobriety and the years that led to it, which has created a more complete picture of who he is than his earlier career ever did. But the audience and the guests he can access remain considerably smaller than what he once had. A senior national correspondent for a major broadcast network had spent decades covering serious stories across the country, building a reputation as an experienced and credible journalist. His career ended not through investigation or internal conflict, but through a single post on social media made late at night. He posted a message criticizing the president and a senior White House official using language his employer considered a violation of editorial standards. He was suspended immediately and fired 2 days later. He later acknowledged he had been drinking when he made the post, but he also made clear that he stood behind the substance of what he had said and had no regrets about saying it. What made his case interesting was his refusal to follow the typical script. Most journalists in his situation would have issued a careful apology, expressed regret about the timing and language, and attempted to preserve remaining professional relationships. He did the opposite. He said publicly that he meant what he wrote and that the only thing he regretted was the circumstances. That stance closed doors that a more conciliatory response might have left open, but it also reflected consistency of character that his supporters pointed to as evidence that his journalism had always been driven by genuine conviction. Since his firing, he has launched a Substack newsletter focused on political commentary with over 100,000 subscribers by 2026, a real audience by newsletter standards, but a fraction of the millions he once reached. Then there was a capable daytime anchor at a major cable news network who spent 13 years building a reputation as one of the most competent people on her network. In February 2021, she announced on air that she was leaving to pursue other opportunities. The announcement was framed as her personal decision. It wasn't. 3 years later, she disclosed in an essay that she had been fired. The situation had begun when she relocated from Atlanta to New York, but her executive producer remained in Atlanta. She requested a different producer, a standard industry request, which was denied. She was taken off air for 2 months. In January 2021, she was terminated entirely. She stayed quiet for 3 years, partly because she was still processing what happened and partly because legal and professional complexities made speaking openly difficult. When she eventually told her story publicly, she was more specific and detailed than she would have been immediately after the firing. Those 3 years of silence gave her the distance to describe accurately rather than reactively. Since then, she has not returned to mainstream broadcast journalism. She hosts a podcast through Substack and describes herself as self-employed. The platform she built over 13 years at her previous network hasn't been replaced by anything comparable. Like other fallen anchors, she represents a quieter outcome. A long career ended abruptly, followed by a life that is still being figured out. These stories reveal uncomfortable truths about visibility and vulnerability in the television industry. Some falls come from genuine misconduct. Some come from political maneuvering. Some come from a single mistake or moment of bad judgment that spirals into professional death. What they share is the common experience of vanishing, sometimes completely, sometimes partially, always fundamentally. The faces that were trusted morning after morning simply cease to appear. The question of what happens to them after, and who they become when the platform is gone, reveals something important about identity, resilience, and the distance between public persona and private person. Some attempted to rebuild and found modest success. Some disappeared entirely and never attempted to return. Some pursued completely different paths that had nothing to do with journalism or broadcasting. And some, perhaps most painfully, found that the identity they had spent years or decades constructing was the very thing that prevented them from moving forward to anything new. These aren't just stories about career failure. They're stories about what happens when the spotlight goes off and the cameras stop rolling. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.